Today we're going to be looking at a very complex topic, which is called Orientalism. And so I wanted to do a spoken lecture for this part of the course because it is a fairly complicated idea and I want to make sure you understand it. Now, if you have questions, I invite you to contact me. I'm always available. So please don't feel shy about getting in touch with me. We can set up office hours, or we can talk on the phone, or you can email me. And this is, of course, always true going forward. The ideas that we'll be looking at in this class are developed from the work of Edward Said, who was a Palestinian-American academic, activist, and literary critic. And he wrote extensively on literature through the lens of social and cultural politics. And he developed a term that he called Orientalism. Said's book Orientalism was published in 1978 and immediately caused a firestorm of controversy. He was lauded and attacked in equal measure for his ideas, and which is often the case with influential work. So essentially, over time, this book and its ideas have transformed the ways in which South Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East are studied now. I'm including here a quotation from the book, and I highly recommend that you read the whole thing if you're interested in this topic. It really is one of the most important books of the 20th century. So Said writes, Orientalism is a body and tradition of Western representations of the Orient. And so here we have one of the key ideas, that it's about representing the Orient, or the quote-unquote East. So it's not about what actually is, it's about the Western imagination. And so this comes to include literature, magazines, film, television, and on, looking at the ways in which this becomes a lens through which we look at the quote-unquote East. He goes on to say, created in the context of Western political dominance over the Orient. So this refers to colonialism and the fact that empires like the British and the French were increasingly taking over larger and larger parts of the world and controlling them. And so he goes on to say, which understand and master the inferior, inherently opposed Orient, and which bear more relationship to each other as a discourse than to the real diverse experiences of people who live in the Middle East. And so what he's getting at here is, even if we ask ourselves, what do we mean by the East? It depends on where you're standing. If I'm living in China, then, India is the West. So the East is really something created from the point of view of the Western world within the dynamic of control and dominance. So Said applies his idea of the other to the East. From this point of view, the Orient is seen as feminine, lazy, inferior, and irrational, in opposition to the West, which presents itself as masculine, active, dominant, and rational. So I'm giving you an example of a very typical Orientalist romantic style painting of the Victorian era. The harem was an object of great fascination to a lot of Western writers and painters. And so we see an image of the Orient, quote unquote, the harem girl who is completely indolent, who's exoticized and eroticized, and in this very beautiful, sensual setting. So this is a very kind of, I would say, condensed version of how the West begins to view the East. The image I'm showing you here is a representation of East Asian Orientalism. And so the idea of Orientalism begins to be used outside of the Middle East to look at the way that China and India and places like Thailand are depicted. And so this poster is from a 1929 film called The Mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu. And so here we have a number of the images of the negative East. So the East being sinister and mysterious and dangerous. And as is often the case, we see that the actor is not in fact Chinese. He's in kind of quote unquote yellow face. And this movie is being created at a time when there's a lot of controversy about Chinese immigration into places like the United States and Canada. And so the movie is also kind of depicting that concern. Here's another example. This is the 1931 film Daughter of the Dragon. It features Chinese-American actress Anna May Wong, who had actually a very successful career, but she almost always was forced to play either dragon ladies or femme fatales. And you can see here she's menacing these nice blonde people. So it doesn't take a lot of analysis to figure out what this is trying to telegraph. So this kind of threat of both the male and the female Chinese person. My previous examples have been drawn from painting and from film. I wanted to look just quickly here at news media. And so I am hoping you will begin to pay attention to not just to the written text of newspapers and magazines and how they depict countries in the Middle East and South and East Asia, but also the photographs. The photographs are often what people see. They may not read the article or not the whole article. So the photograph becomes a very important part of the way it is being telegraphed. So here we have a very typical photograph from any of the newspapers in the Western world of a protest. And so this is very typical of when political events from the Middle East are covered. Generally, we're shown a crowd of people. Here we see they have their mouths open. They're looking like they're on the verge of violence of some kind. And so really, on a certain subliminal level, we are being shown the dangerousness of this part of the world and the people in it, because they're sort of a mass of people. There's no idea of them as individuals. Here we have an image from a protest that centers mostly on women, and the idea of the quote-unquote Eastern woman is also a trope of Orientalism. Here they're looking more active, again, kind of like they're on the verge of perhaps violence. So we get this kind of dichotomy of the passive East and then possibly the violent East. Now, the issue of women is a central part of Orientalism, and so going right back to that harem image, we often find in Western media the idea of the Oriental woman or the Eastern woman who needs saving by the West, saving from the men of their own culture. And so obviously most of you will know about the controversy around the hijab in countries like France and in the province of Quebec. And so it's very clear that these images remain alive. This isn't just a historical thing that we've left in the past. As time has gone on, other scholars have applied Said's idea of Orientalism to other parts of the world, including countries like India. And so the image I'm offering you here is of the book A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. This was also made into a very popular film. And in many ways, A Passage to India includes within it both affirmative and negative Orientalism. So negative Orientalism is more what I've been talking about in the last few slides, where the East is depicted as explicitly sinister and dangerous and irrational. With affirmative Orientalism, we see a more romantic approach. So this has been just as prevalent. And so I'm attaching this to the discussion in your textbook of the Oriental monk. So the author there connects this figure down through history. So we find this figure of the benevolent, paternal, spiritual mentor, and this can be seen in the figure of the Dalai Lama or the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But it remains a form of Orientalism. Here you can see an image from the 1992 Disney animated feature Aladdin. This was very controversial, and then again, when it was remade, it caused controversy again because apparently Disney executives haven't read the book Orientalism and haven't learned their lesson. But we can see immediately why this is a problem. So the figure of the Arab here is clearly sinister and menacing. And there was also a great deal of controversy over the lyrics of some of the songs in the movie. Another important scholar who builds on the work of Said is David Spur, who wrote The Rhetoric of Empire in 1993. And in this work, he focuses on travel writing and its descendant journalism. And he notes that when travel writers look at many other countries, particularly in the so-called East, they often focus on certain aspects of what can be termed the abject. So here we have a very typical image of extreme poverty. And so I would argue that for a lot of people in the Western world, this is one of the images that leaps to mind immediately when we think of India. And this is important because it links to the idea that Spur talks about, that somehow the Western world has the right of surveillance and judgment over the Eastern world. And also, this focus on poverty obscures the impacts of colonialism. The whole reason that empires like the Dutch and the British and the French wanted to go to countries like India was because of its vast wealth. And so we see a kind of inversion here. And I'm not saying there isn't poverty in India. Obviously there is, as there is in every country. But this creates an image of India only as sort of defined by its poverty. And now we come to Apu. Really, don't get me started on this. I've had so many arguments with people about this. Many people argue that this is a completely harmless depiction. It's a very loving, affectionate depiction, etc., etc. I'm not going to say a lot because I'm having you look at the whole documentary on this. But I do think it's really important to recognize that, in fact, these depictions have real life impact on people. And you'll see in the documentary that the director interviews a number of young people who talk about how they've been treated as a result of the influence of the figure of Apu. Okay, so coming to the end of this lecture, I wanted to move us right into the contemporary period. And this is a phenomenon I've noticed across media, including in vlogs and so on, Instagram. So people are using the term Zen, often related to home decor. So I'm just giving you one example I just pulled up from the internet. And so this sort of vaguely Japanese looking, Asian looking room. And so this is another version of Orientalism and the way it impacts also decor, which is perhaps not an area we would necessarily think about. But I think it's important to think of what we mean when we use the term Zen and remove it radically from its religious context. In this final slide, I'm showing you an image of a teacher training flyer. So you're supposed to transform your life through Zen flow. So Zen coming from the Buddhist tradition, yoga coming from the Hindu tradition, and being mixed together in this very peculiar way in a kind of lifestyle gym kind of approach. So this is very typical of the way that yoga has been transformed in the Western world. It's not the only version. We see versions that cleave much more to the tradition, but this one is a very typical kind of bricolage of where these different aspects of quote-unquote Eastern religion are blended together with no sense of a context or a history. And I think another very important point here is that this kind of created form of quasi-religion then becomes a commodity that can be sold. And so this is something very new in terms of how religion is being approached.